Hello, friend. This is Ryan Hicks of TalkToProfit.com. And today we'll talk about how Christian doomsday preppers are doubting God and they're ruled by fear. Over the years since I became a Christian when I was 16 years old, I have seen so many iterations of doomsday prepping and all kinds of nonsense. And this has been literally over 30 years ago. It's been going on way before that. And it's just people who are ruled by fear. But what's very important is they're not hearing from God. If you talk to a Christian prepper, somebody at least professes to be a Christian as a prepper, they will tell you as an excuse, well, but Noah prepared, failing to realize that Noah actually had a word from God. They'll talk about, well, Joseph was a prepper, so I'm just following after Joseph, because Joseph also had a word from God. These are people who don't have a word from God, but they have a word from the news media. And I've literally talked to these people, and I'm trying to be nice about this and as gentle as possible, but so many of them are super mentally ill and completely doubting God and have zero faith or super limited faith. And they can't grasp the fact that them watching the news and getting afraid is not wisdom from God. It's not being prudent. It's not being wise. It is being a fool who is led around by the snout by the world and the devil. And I'm going to be very blunt here about this. Any belief system that has you continually rooted and grounded in fear is of the devil. It's not of God. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. So any belief system has you fretting and worrying and prepping is not of God. And you can't go to the Old Testament. How often do people go to the Old Testament to try to make excuses and justify their unbelief and justify their sins? If you're going back to the Old Testament to try to find an excuse for why you don't believe God today, for why you don't believe that what Jesus said, that you can have what you say, why you don't believe that God will provide for you, why you don't believe that God's good, you are on the devil's side and you're not following God. And I don't care if you call yourself a Christian. I don't care if you're a pastor or a preacher or an evangelist or whatever title you want to give yourself. You may be a pastor, you may be an evangelist, you may be a preacher, but you're doing all those things for Satan. Because God is not teaching people to be in fear. God is not teaching people to be afraid. You don't have the new birth and become a Christian to go live like an Old Testament believer who knew nothing or had such limited beliefs and didn't understand God and didn't walk with God and didn't have the Spirit of God. And you go run back to things they were told to do that has nothing to do with you today. Especially when you're not even hearing from God, you're hearing from the news media. You're hearing from other people who are afraid. Well, I heard they're going to do this. I've heard so many ridiculous, nonsensical things. And here's one of the things about a lot of these conspiracies that these professing Christians come up with to keep them rooted and grounded in their fear so they can prep more, is they're ordering all these body bags. They're planning on killing a bunch of Christians. Never happened. That was decades ago. Every year there's some new thing that the government's getting ready to kill people. Oh, with the pandemic stuff, it was, they're trying to kill Christians, and didn't happen. Did people die? Of course. But most Christians, and the ones I knew who were walking with God and full of faith, nothing bad happened during that pandemic. I know some people had problems, and I'm not discounting that. But this blanket, the world's coming out to get you, it's almost like people want to be victims. And I get that today that's a big thing. Not even talking about in professing Christians, but in the world in general. Everybody wants to be a victim. Somebody said something bad, so I'm going to take offense at it, even though it has nothing to do with me. I'm going to go purposely read something that somebody said that I might be offended by, so I can get myself offended. Who does that? But people today do that. They want to be victims. And professing Christians are looking for every conspiracy they can find to try to make themselves out to be the poor innocent victim. And so I need to prep more to justify, because they know deep down in their heart Their prepping is done from fear. It is done from a lack of love of God. It is done from a lack of trust in God. You know, that verse I quote in Mark chapter 11, verse 23 so often that it's so powerful, and people need to realize it and get it rooted and grounded in their system so where they can believe it so they can get what they say. But the verse right before that, laying the foundation for it, is Jesus says to have faith in God. You're not going to get what you say if you don't have faith in God. You're not going to get what you say if you're trembling in fear because the news said there might be a war coming. Listen, if you know that there's a storm coming your way, yes, do the proper things that would prepare your house and your animals and yourself to avoid danger, of course. Use common sense. But prepping is not common sense. Prepping is fear. Prepping is doubt in God. Prepping is unbelief. And it is truly faith in the devil. It's faith that the devil's going to do more than God can do. It's faith that the devil is going to wreak more havoc than God's goodness can overflow into your life. But the scripture I read says that if we submit ourselves unto God and resist the devil, he'll flee from us. How is the devil getting such a hand in your life and overcoming you and defeating you everywhere you turn that you need to be prepping because you're not going to have any supplies, you're going to have any food, you're going to be without, you got to get all these guns and stuff. I talked to one guy, he was talking about how, I need to do this because, you didn't see the news. You need to watch the news and understand what's going on in the world. And he's been babbling this stuff for over a decade now, and he's always wrong. He always changes the scenario and pretends like he was right when nothing ever happens. And his scenario is that, I got to be afraid because the news is telling me to be afraid. And he doesn't word it that way because he's smart enough. A lot of these people they're not dumb. They're just super afraid. Many of them are kind of having arrested development. Maybe they grew up and their parents kind of took care of them their entire lives. And they're just kind of still infantile in their thinking. And because they always had a parent or somebody providing for them, even as adults, then they view the world as if their parents' protection might be lost because they're getting older. And then there's no one to protect them. So they got to protect themselves. They got to prep for themselves. Never understanding that's not faith in God. If you don't believe God and you believe your own prepping is somehow going to be more valuable to you and is going to do more good in the world than God can, you're lost and without hope. Except you believe on Jesus, truly believe on him, and get away from all that doubt and unbelief. And I talked to one of these individuals before, and he was bragging about all his guns and weapons he had. And he's hoarding up gold and silver like that. What is that going to do? Who's going to take your gold and silver if there's a famine going around? It's insanity. If there's some breakdown, there's no internet, there's no electricity, and there's famine, and they're going to take your gold when everybody's starving? Does that make any sense? But that's the scenarios they play out in their minds, these fanciful scenarios that will never happen. But he's hoarding up weapons to kill people who might come onto his property to get some of his hoarded up garbage. The insanity of thinking that you're a believer, and if somebody comes to your property because they're hungry, you're not only going to turn them away, you're going to potentially kill them and murder them because they're hungry. That's where it really indicates the true heart of wickedness that is involved in many of these Christian preppers. Now, I know some of these people are just deceived and they're not trying to do anything wrong. They would actually give if somebody was in need. But the overall mentality is one of not being in faith, not trusting in God. You don't believe God's your provider. You don't believe God's your source. You don't believe God even will provide for you. There's going to be all these bad things happening, and you're going to have to suffer, and you can only depend on yourself. You can only have faith in yourself to provide and not in God. And that, my friends, is evil. And I know people probably don't mean it that way. They probably really are deluded into thinking they're doing some sort of good. They're somehow following God because they're following the news media, the prophets of the world, the prophets of the devil in the news, telling them what to be afraid of. But my friend, that's missing God completely. It's actually turning your back on God, because instead of hearing the voice of the Spirit, you're being led by the voice of the world. You're being led by the spirit of the world, the God of the world, the devil himself. Let me reiterate this point. It's very important. God will never lead you into fear. With God comes peace. With God comes joy. With God comes righteousness. If you have a belief system that got you into fear, if you have a belief system that has you literally ready and preparing, premeditated, preparing to murder people because they might want some of your food, then your belief system is not of God. And you have to repent and believe the gospel and get baptized in the Spirit so you can get away from that nonsense, the fear, and know and trust in God that He will provide for you in any situation, and you'll have an abundance, you'll have blessing, and you will not only have blessing and abundance for yourself and your family, but you'll have enough to bless others. You want to worry about them coming to take it from you, you'll be freely giving because you'll have so much in abundance because you're blessed by God, because you have true faith in God, you believe Him, and you get whatsoever you say. My friend, I pray this is a blessing for you. May God bless you richly.